ARI, which is short for Allies for Refugee Integration, is a collaboration between OCASI and Refugee 613, and we're in the final stages of a 3-year program funded by the Service Delivery Improvement at IRCC. We'd like to start by introducing our team. So Michelle.
Thanks, Barbara. Yes, my name is Michelle Ball, and I am the project coordinator for Allies for Refugee Integration at OCASI. That's the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Lots of acronyms today, but we'll try to avoid too many. And I do want to say that I'm located in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And Barbara and I are very glad to be hosting this roundtable together to get to share everything we've been up to in the last few years with this project. Thanks.
And my name is Barbara Nzigi. I am the ARI project coordinator at Refugee 613, so working with Michelle on this. And I'm located in the Algonquin Anishinaabe Territory, Ottawa. And like Michelle said, we're very excited to be here. We have a few of our partners and collaborators, and we're really excited to hear from them, and in the sharing section in particular. So let's get started. Our agenda today is quite simple. We're going to start with introductions. So we're really going to run through what the ARI project is about and also talk about our pilots. We'll be sharing our finding and some of our experiences. And we have 2 folks here today. So 2 pilot partners who will be sharing their experiences implementing the pilots in their context. And then we'll have a section called Tools and Tips for Settlement Workers and Sponsors, where we're going to talk about the more practical aspects of the pilot's implementation. We'll be ending with a discussion because today we really want to create an interactive space, encouraging discussion and dialogue between everyone who's present. To do that, we're going to be asking for the first section of this discussion to stay on mute. And we are asking everyone to be on mute, but cameras are encouraged to stay on. During the presentation, if you have any questions or comments, we're encouraging you to put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And in the middle of our presentation, once we go through the findings, we will stop for some questions if you have any questions in particular about the findings, so we can answer those. And then we have, at the end, once we've gone through the tools and tips and the practical aspects, we'll have questions and a discussion period. In that discussion period, we will be asking you to raise your hand and we'll be calling on you to ask questions you can turn your mic on at that point, or if you'd prefer, you can leave them in the chat. Does that sound clear?
Awesome.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get started.
Great. So before we get started, it's been great to see everything in the chat, to see, you're all coming from different locations, different backgrounds, but we thought a poll would be kind of fun because the whole goal of today is to bring together frontline settlement workers and sponsors and those who are kind of part of that ecosystem to really engage and connect together. So we want to know who's in the room. So I'm going to launch a poll. For those of you who are new to polls, it's just going to pop up and you just answer. It's a multiple choice, so select all that apply. And we can see the question here, but I'm going to launch the poll. The question is, I am attending this roundtable in my role as ... And then you can select all because sometimes we wear multiple hats, and different identities. So feel free to participate and I will let you see the results momentarily. I wish you could see it like I could see it. It's currently a race between sponsorship agreement holders and settlement agencies mostly, but we have a few different folks as well. I'll wait just a few more moments for everyone to participate. All right, I think that's most of us. So I'll release the polling and share the results with you. I think we mostly have some frontline settlement workers. That makes sense from what people were saying earlier with us today, but we also have some folks from management of settlement agencies, We have 14 people from SAWS and 14 sponsors, so that's quite a lot as well. And we also have some researchers, refugees, government, and other. So that's really cool. I'm going to stop sharing the results. Thank you for participating. And we also wanted to take a quick second to get to know how you're coming into this space today. So if you go to the next slide, we have a quick chat question we wanted you to answer in the chat. You know, part of the goal today is to continue to build that understanding and how settlement and sponsors work together. So I wanted to know, what's one word to describe how you feel about settlement workers and sponsors working together? So in one word, feel free to just put that in the chat. It could be, you know, excited, nervous, curious, you know, maybe a descriptive word. I see we have a lot of teamwork, hesitancy, understanding, important, tense. Yeah, there's definitely tension as well in that relationship. Intrigued. These are great words. Smart, helpful, essential, equal, curious, fruitful. I'd say a mix, of words, Barbara. I think this is really speaking to the relationship. Stressful at times.
It's very interesting. Inspired, necessary, stressful. I think it's a really good reflection of what we've seen and what we know through ARI.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, and that really helps us get off to a start with all these emotions swirling around. So yeah, let's keep that in mind as we move forward we're going to do a bit of talking to share about ARI, and then we'll launch into more of a discussion opportunity. So I am going to start with a quick introduction to Allies for Refugee Integration. For some of you, it will be really familiar, and maybe some of you it's new. So I did want to take a moment to really set the stage if you're new, to understand where this is coming from. So Allies for Refugee Integration began because of what we saw on the ground, OCASI and Refugee 613 and others. We saw that settlement workers and sponsors were not always working well together, and they were sometimes, you know, duplicating efforts or struggling to understand how they could support sponsored refugees in practice. And so the central question became, how do we bring these two allies together so we can firstly improve understanding of each other, and secondly, to really, you know, understand and remove the barriers that existed to collaboration, also on a policy and practice level. So we began with a research phase back in 2018 to better understand the problem. And more than 250 people across Ontario and beyond helped us to identify those gaps, but also to tell us the direction in which they thought improvement could really head, suggestions for what that could look like. So thank you. I know a lot of you on the call were part of that. We then did in 2019 collaborative design sessions across Ontario, where people came together and really just, you know, really designed prototypes in a really practical way to say, these are different ideas that could help us to work better together for sponsored refugees. More than 15 different prototypes were made in those days, and it was really exciting to see people on the ground be able to have a real impact on potential solutions to gaps they were seeing. By the beginning of 2020, we had partnered with agencies across Ontario to begin piloting the top 2 ideas and evaluate their impact. And that's what today is really about, is to tell you what happened in those pilots and what that leads to in the future. I would like to take a moment then to talk about our pilot partners. Many of them are on the call today, and it would not have been possible, obviously, to do any of this work without the immense the immense work that they put into these pilots. So a special call out today to Catholic Cross Cultural Services and RSTP, to the YMCA of Three Rivers and the Mennonite Central Committee of Ontario, to YMCA of Southwestern Ontario and Diocese of London Refugee Ministries, and Immigrant Services Kingston and area. You put so much into these pilots in the past year, in a really stressful year. We'll talk later about pivoting, isn't that the word of 2020? And you all did that very well, so thank you for everything. And thank you too to those who have been part of this project from the beginning. It's really great to see the kind of culmination today. So it was really a group effort to get us here. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Barbara to tell us more about what exactly we tested.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's talk about our pilots. As Michelle just mentioned, we chose our top 2 ideas to pilot across Ontario in 2020. Our first idea was the intentional connection pilots. In this pilot, we connected settlement providing organizations, SPOs, with sponsorship agreement holders, SAS, through formal partnerships. This allowed sponsors and refugees to be linked with a settlement worker both pre and post arrival to discuss their roles and align their efforts. We tested these pilots in 3 locations, connecting 23 sponsors, 68 refugees, and 5 settlement workers. This practice really boiled down to 3 stages. We had what we call the pre-arrival stage. This was a first meeting between sponsor and settlement worker for role division and orientation to the services that were available. Our second stage, our post-arrival stage, happened after the refugee had arrived and was really setting up a 3-way meeting, in person or virtually, of course, because 2020 was a year we pivoted to virtual, between the refugee sponsor and the settlement worker for orientation. The last stage, which is ongoing services, is where we had the usual confidential intake with the refugees, but with the sponsors looped in to the requests and able to access settlement workers if they needed to. Our second idea was the knowledge exchange pilot. Like the name suggests, for this pilot, we brought together our different actors, so sponsors, settlement agencies and workers and refugees, for virtual discussions and information sharing sessions. The events were created really in a forest bias style with an advisory of SAS, sponsors and refugees supporting the planning, implementation, and also presenting at these events. They covered varying topics, including settlement access, mental health, and housing. These events were unique in that they brought together the whole community. So we had health partners, local government, et cetera, and really allowed participants to exchange information with sponsors and refugees who were able to share their experience and resources. In the end, we had 70 people participating in 5 knowledge exchange events led by our pilot partner, Immigrant Services, Kingston and area.
Thank you, Barbara. So now that you know what we tested, I'm going to be sharing with you what we learned. So this section is a little bit intense, but I think you're here because you want to know what did people actually experience through these pilots. So I'm going to be sharing that with you. I want to mention at this point that evaluation was a massive part of this project. We worked with an external evaluator and used tools like surveys, interviews, and tracking of the activities and indicators with the pilots to really measure the impact and even make adjustments throughout the year. So I'm going to walk you through the data a little bit by each of the stakeholders and hear what they had to say. And then we're going to have a chance to hear directly from some of the participants of the pilots. Before we start to talk about data, however, we need to talk about the COVID-19 context. So if you want to go to the next slide. Obviously, you know, as mentioned, this wasn't a normal year. And of course, it had impacts on how we were able to test these pilots. The first obvious impact was that privately sponsored refugees were not arriving in large numbers when we started testing this about a year ago. And so we actually had to delay our testing in a lot of ways until the fall of 2020. And we adapted by bringing on a new pilot. So shout out to our new pilot who came on in fall 2020 to help us meet those numbers. And we ended up, concentrating more on the immediate moment of arrival instead of long-term impacts on refugees, which we weren't able to really be able to measure as much as a result. Of course, we moved events online. Our ISCA pilot, our knowledge exchange pilot, ended up wanting to do things in person, and we had to do it virtually. And we ended up learning a lot about virtual service delivery. And it's pretty cool, actually. We got to see on the ground the benefits and the challenges of building settlement sponsor relationships in a virtual space. And we can talk about that more later. As mentioned, we were only able to capture short-term outcomes, such as outcomes in terms of awareness of services and the impact of having partnerships rather than the longer-term impacts, say, of integration over the long term. And lastly, there were challenges in evaluation. So we didn't get to see any refugees in person. And so we definitely had to rely upon telephone interviews and other tools that frankly, were challenging at times. And so we wish we could continue to test this further, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Well, what did we find then? Let's get into it. Next slide. So our overall findings. These emerged as the top 3 kind of themes for success through these pilots. First was proactive connection. We found that the timely and early connection of refugees and sponsors to a service provider made it easier for everyone to be on the same page and get the information they needed at the right time. And so we found that at the right time was usually right pre or post arrival rather than down the road for a more successful journey. We found that having one place to access information was extremely valuable, especially for sponsors and refugees. They really want to be able to go to one person to be able to access that information instead of shopping around trying to find support in different agencies. And lastly, organizational partnerships. We were really surprised to hear that sponsorship agreement holders, or SAS, and settlement providing organizations, or SPOs, they really found the most impactful change that they reported was actually on them as organizations and how they work together behind the scenes to support one another in their work. That was pretty cool, and we'll hear more about that later. So what did we hear from refugees specifically? They appreciated a timely and personal contact for navigation of services. So during COVID, they all arrived this past year. Many of them expressed isolation, and they said that having that settlement worker, even pre-arrival, was really useful in mitigating some of their concerns and their confusion on arriving in Canada during this challenging time. They really appreciated having access to a settlement worker who spoke their language, and it would help a lot, obviously, when not all sponsors would speak their language, and it helped all 3 of them be able to work better together. It clarified roles for them, but interestingly, they reported that they felt it clarified roles for their sponsors. Some of them said that, for example, they had family, maybe their family were their sponsors. And they said, even though their family members were newcomers themselves, they needed to know some updated information, things that had changed since they had arrived in Canada. And it helped, with that dynamic. Of course, the last thing refugees definitely spoke about was the importance of choice. So in all of these suggestions we're making, it's important to refugees, and of course, important to all of us, that refugees continue to have choice in which agency they access and in how sponsors are involved in their settlement journey. I have a quote here from one of the refugees who participated, who said, "These interactions with the settlement worker are wonderful. We don't know anyone here and only met our sponsors a few times due to COVID. It is helpful to ask questions, how to get different documents, and more." So what did we hear then from settlement workers who participated? They expressed that the early connection to sponsors especially really improved communication. And, it was funny, a lot of the settlement workers said to me, it's so different. I see sponsors not just at the point of crisis, which is when they would usually see as sponsors when things were going wrong. When they saw them earlier, it helped to develop trust. And that's really essential in order to work together effectively. Settlement workers also reported that it helped them in their work to be able to get to know information about those newcomers in advance and early in order to better support them. So as an example, one of the settlement workers learned about a medical condition through connecting early with that newcomer. And they were able to, as soon as they arrived to Canada, respond and put things in place with the sponsor to make sure that they had the support they needed. Settlement workers did talk about how there is a lot of upfront effort, however, in doing this practice. And it's important to say that settlement workers have a lot on their plates. They all said that it really was worthwhile in the long run to be able to do this work with sponsors. However, it took longer in order to get them on board in the first place, especially in this context of onboarding through technology. It just took more time. We did do a training for settlement workers on how to work with refugees and sponsored refugees with RSTP. So shout out to RSTP on the call. We trained 153 settlement workers, and it was a very successful training. And, as you can see here, 90% said it helped them understand sponsor responsibilities better. That was another success. The settlement agency staff said that connection to one settlement worker provides a streamlined and coordinated way of navigating settlement, as well as other government and community resources. What did we hear from sponsors? They talked about how having shared responsibility really reduced the burden on them. They were really relieved to know that they have access to an expert with that up-to-date information. They liked having someone to ask questions to, and they reported feeling better prepared through joint settlement planning. And by joint settlement planning, I don't just mean the usual settlement plan, but having a specific plan for that refugee right before arrival that's updated, that's ready to go, where you can speak to a settlement worker about their specific needs, really helped them hit the ground running when it was time. Sponsors also wanted flexibility in the practice. So every sponsor is different. Every refugee is different. We know this. And so we can't expect a one size fits all. So we do need to be flexible to meet those different needs and situations of sponsors and sponsored refugees. And you can see here, these meetings were very successful at communication. And compared to previous experiences, 3.6 out of 5, which were more negative. So I think it really seemed like a positive experience. Yes, you can go to the next slide. The quote that says, "We need a central place to turn. Enthusiasm in the group dissipates a lot by just trying to understand who is out there doing what. What we are missing is the process. We do a lot of unnecessary research when the pros already know." The last group we're going to talk about is the organizational level, and these are mostly our piloting agencies, what we heard from them. They reported that mutual learning on an organizational level was really useful. So settlement agencies were able to learn about sponsorship, and SAWs were able to learn more about settlement. And even long-term staff, who've been doing this for a long time, 10, 20 years, expressed, I learned new things through this process. There's always more to learn, isn't there? So it really helped them on that level. It allowed for seamless referrals, which is something that's super important for a more seamless journey of referral to settlement supports. And it enabled that behind the scenes flagging of cases early. So if there was a challenge, it was addressed earlier on, which is really valuable. You don't lose time waiting until something gets to a worse crisis. The other thing to mention here is that, all of the pilots say they recommend scaling this up. However, have concerns about capacity and especially sponsorship agreement holders who are often voluntary or don't have a lot of extra capacity. And this is something we're going to deal with a little bit in our recommendations. This quote, last quote, talks about how open communication between agencies about cases where follow-up is needed allowed us to coordinate our efforts more effectively and ensured better outcomes for clients. The second pilot idea, we wanted to talk specifically about what we learned because it's very related to what we were saying, but also slightly different, and it's virtual events. What did we learn about these? So we heard that it helped agencies be more responsive to refugees. So as an example, the pilot surveyed sponsors and refugees in the community, asking what events they wanted, and it helped them to understand what topics were of interest to them and be able to respond. It also helped build partnerships, which included, health partners, former refugees, and in this case, a new partnership with a SAW was a really, one thing we heard was really beneficial and hopefully a long-term new partnership for this agency. And 90% of those who did participate and surveyed for these pilots said it really helped them understand what was available locally. So that's a lot of information. I promise this is pretty much the end of the Michelle Talks to You section, but you might be wondering, okay, this is great. We learned a lot. What happens now? Because Allies for Refugee Integration is not just about learning. We want to put this into action. And it's really important to us that change happens. For that reason, we have 4 recommendations that we've made to IRCC, that's Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. So the whole purpose of this project, in a big way, was to make suggestions on that policy practice level, and we want to share them with you today. If you're curious about these, we have another roundtable next week where we go into the policy and organizational level learning. And so we're not going to go into this in great detail because we wanted to spend more time talking to one another about the nitty-gritty today. But I thought you'd be curious. So these are our recommendations to IRCC. Firstly, to create a policy of intentional connection practice, as just described, to help with that pre-post arrival coordination. We are recommending to scale up that pre-post arrival connection for sponsors and sponsored refugees. Secondly, to support SAWs and sponsorship agreement holders and settlement providing organizations to create formal partnerships. And we make recommendations on what that could look like in our report that we'll be sharing with you soon, as well as next week in our roundtable. The third recommendation is that we're encouraging SPOs to include sponsors and SAWs as full partners in information exchange opportunities. This is coming out of the knowledge exchange pilot, where settlement agencies don't just treat SAWs as an afterthought, but are really actively participating in a more community-wide approach to welcoming refugees and to responding to the needs that refugees might have as a whole community together. The last recommendation is to further test and define the intentional connection practice in order to scale up. The reason that we have this here is that we learned a lot this year. We believe that this practice had really amazing benefits. However, continued testing would be really helpful. We weren't able to test everywhere, so continued testing in different parts of Canada, continued testing with Group of 5 and community sponsors. We were not able to test in a meaningful way with those sponsors. We mostly worked with those sponsors connected to a sponsorship agreement holder. And there's a lot of different ways that we could continue to test this model by scaling it up and seeing how it works with other policies on a national level. So that's why we have this recommendation to continue to test this as we scale it up. Those are our recommendations, and I'm going to pause at this point because this is, the information heavy part of our presentation. And I'm going to say, if you have questions about what we learned, about the pilots, please put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand option, and you can unmute yourself. Barbara will be keeping an eye out for that. So I'm just going to take a moment and let you digest some of that and see if you have questions about what we learned. I see there's a practical question about getting access to the recorded session of today's events. Yes, so it was requested that we record this event. We will share it with you in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. so you can share with some of your colleagues. Thank you for that question.
Oh, I have one raised hand. Aziz?
Hi, a very interesting project and definitely very important. I was wondering about one area, and that was the knowledge exchange pilot. And that was confined to three domains of integration. One, accessing settlement, the other one, mental health, and the third one, housing. Can you tell me why confining it to these three domains? Any particular reason for that?
Thank you for your question, Aziz. Yeah, so we actually did 5 virtual knowledge exchange events in Kingston. I think I see our pilot partners are on the call. So if they want to explain better, they can. I'll take a stab and I'll let them jump in if they want. But when we had to transfer from in-person to virtual back a year ago, we did a needs assessment with sponsors. So it was really based on what the community had asked for. Housing and how to access settlement were some things that came up as essential and urgent issues for them. And when one had been done on health, just health in general, we found that it was too much to cover in one session. So we ended up doing one specifically about mental health. So I guess my answer is it comes straight from those who are asking for these events. That's super important. And it wasn't that we confined ourselves to that. It's just we only did the 5 events. I think there were further topics that were of interest. So you're a SAW as well. Are there certain topics you think maybe aren't covered in that list? I'm curious.
And one more question. In terms of making a distinction between settlement and integration. So settlement usually refers to the initial the stages of refugees' adaptation to a new environment, and integration is usually long-term. Have you made a distinction in your project between the two? Because when we talk about the responsibilities of SAWS towards sponsored refugees, it usually is to the initial settlement needs of refugees rather than their long-term integration.
Thank you for that question, Aziz. And maybe I'll start, and Barbara, if you have anything you'd like to add. So we are called Allies for Refugee Integration. And, ultimately our long-term goal is for, to have communities where sponsored refugees are able to be, full members of the community. And we called this report that we put out Welcoming Communities because we ended up concentrating mostly on that immediate arrival, about how we as individuals and agencies all have a responsibility to create welcoming communities in advance and upon the arrival of newcomers. We were limited in what we could test because it was just 1 year. And so we did end up focusing more on the immediate arrival experience. But I think ultimately the goal is that we could test more to see the long-term impacts of how this welcome really leads to, longer term positive impacts. Barbara, do you have anything else to add about settlement versus integration?
No, I think, yes, it's important to have those distinctive terms to understand that difference, but they are ultimately both part of one process. And like Michelle said, it's really bringing those two sides together and really creating a seamless transition between both. Yeah, that's all I would add. Thank you, Aziz.
Also, I see someone drawing on the slide. So if you're doing that, please don't, but thank you. I know you're probably just having fun with the buttons. I see there's a few questions in the chat, Barbara.
So I can read the first one. So many SPOs have a privacy and confidentiality agreement with the sponsored refugees. While I agree this is necessary, at the same time, sponsors are often navigating settlement blindly. not knowing what has been offered to the sponsored family or how to sustain those recommendations by the SPOs. Was this concern ever brought up? And from your pilot programs, was there any resolve to alleviate this tension between the sponsors and the SPOs? That'll be the first question from Andrea.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I know Andrea. Hi. Yeah, so I mean, this tension is kind of what led to the project in the first place, right? Is that on a systems level, there are gaps and barriers to collaboration. What I can say is, yes, you know, through the pilots, we did find a way around that. There's a few answers to this. One, on an organizational level, SAWS and SPOs signed, you know, agreements for information sharing in an understanding that that refugee was still in charge of, you know, information sharing and what was shared, right? So I think this is something that continues, that we are not able to solve all on our own, but we did find that, you know, when settlement agencies and SPOs had an understanding of each other's roles and boundaries, they were better able to communicate if there was, you know, issues or what's happening, what's coming up in a way that was still keeping that refugee in the driver's seat, right? Usually the refugee, well, always the refugee was would be told, this is what's happening, this is what will be shared and so on, right? That's essential. It's not perfect, you know, but I think that it was a really great step in the right direction. And not all agencies have this issue. It really depends, you know, on how they approach their work, how they're funded and so on, right? I don't know, Barbara, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's a great answer. Do you want to take a next question?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, by referring to settlement workers as experts and professionals, does this infer that sponsors do not bring expertise and professionalism to the relationship? Also, with the wording ensure a good settlement, does that indicate the sponsors have not done a good job? Were these the findings of the project?
Thank you, Helen, for your question. Yeah, I think so. Again, this is the tension that we see. And, you know, I think that when we talk about the different roles of sponsor and settlement worker, it's not to say that one is, you know, like the lead and the follower, or one is professional and one is not good in any way at all. I think, you know, we see the settlement worker as a professional, and what we mean by that is that they have access to those more formal supports and resources in the community, more of a formal support, and they have boundaries and things they cannot do. Whereas a sponsor is more, it's not their profession. They're a sponsor. They have a very specific responsibility and they can do it very professionally. It's not a judgment on their ability to do their job well, but they are separate roles we really saw in the pilots. Sponsors saw settlement workers as the expert in those settlement services, not in all things. And so that's why we really believe it's important for the mutual sharing and, you know, that mutuality and seeing each other as partners in the work, because everyone brings something important. Anything to add?
I would only add that it's really, when we speak of sponsors, settlement workers and refugees, everyone is an actor and everyone has a role to play. None, like you said, there's no hierarchy in the way we are describing them and talking about the contributions. All of those contributions are ultimately in the end super valuable, and it's really, this project is really about creating a harmony in collaboration, and that collaboration ultimately is what is the most important relationship here.
Yeah, I would just add, you know, this is not trying to say that the settlement worker takes over from a sponsor in any way either. The sponsor has their responsibilities, and there are many experienced sponsors who've been doing this for 30 years, you know, very well. What we saw in the pilots though, is that settlement, you know, sponsors were very excited that they had an ally that they could access when they needed it for that up-to-date information. That was the role that they really saw. And I think that settlement workers, you know, also saw sponsors as, oh, they can do things that we can't do. They can pick them up from the airport. They can, you know, go to their house at 2 a.m. if they need support. Like it's apples and oranges, right? Yeah.
Okay. Let's take the question from Barbara and then we'll come back to the chat.
Okay.
Barbara?
Hello, thank you for this. My name is Barbara Treviranus, and I am currently on a few sponsorship groups here in Toronto. So first of all, apologies to Marilyn. You're absolutely right. I am going to be even more Ontario-centric or large city-centric. So the spirit of my question comes from the reality that Toronto particularly is quite different from other parts of the country. And Ontario generally is characterized by many more smaller settlement agencies. You're quite lucky in some communities from the perspective that we have here in Toronto that you've got sort of one-stop shopping settlement agencies that you can go to. And for many sponsorship agreement holders and their settlement groups or sponsorship groups across the country, you've got a great long-standing relationship. My question, first of all, thank you so much for the report and for the work on this. My question is just, how have you handled that issue of which agency to go to? Because you're absolutely right. Once you find that ally as a sponsor with a settlement agency, it really does help the process. You can establish the relationship. You can sign a confidentiality agreement, which the refugee then, which I would, post-arrival consider the sponsored newcomer or no longer a refugee, but they have the confidence of knowing what information is shared. But taking it back a step, the reality we have is that unfortunately settlement agencies have to compete for funds and compete therefore for clients. And sometimes it's tough therefore to find the agency that is best placed, and it might be multiple agencies for the different members of the family. So what have you had any ideas about addressing that challenge of indeed finding the agency that's the best placed, which isn't the same for every newcomer family the sponsoring group might sponsor? Thank you.
I'll take a stab at that, and then maybe Barbara, if you want to add. Yeah, great question. I think, okay, a few things come to mind. We worked a lot on the organizational SOSPO level in these pilots, as you saw, right? And so, in terms of who you access and who you partner with, it ended up being really organic in different communities throughout Ontario, which agencies ended up working together. And I actually just want to address the Ontario comment. Absolutely, we're extremely Ontario-centric because that was actually the scope of our project. We are Ontario focused, but we really believe it has national implications, which is why we wanted to share this more broadly. So I'm sorry, I would love to do something national after this and see all of your amazing different experiences, different places. Yeah, so each agency kind of ended up partnering with a SPO and a SAW that kind of made sense. So as one example, in Southwestern Ontario, they already had a pre-existing relationship as an agency, and therefore, they had that understanding and trust that they could build upon, because that's so important. I want to say, we're going to later on talk about tips for sponsors, and we talk a little bit about how there are different, we would encourage you to, so RSTP right now, maybe May is on here. They're going to be helping sponsors find settlement agencies that are able to support them and work with them. So finding, using different bodies such as RSTP and others to kind of navigate which agencies might be appropriate is one way. I guess the other thing to mention is just because you found an agency that works for you doesn't mean that newcomer will want to go to that agency. So it's super important that we are flexible in understanding that it's ultimately not up to us as sponsors or settlement agencies where those newcomers choose to go in the long term. It's an incomplete answer. I wonder if Barbara or anyone else wants to add anything.
I think you've really touched on it. This is unfortunately a smaller project. We weren't able to do everything we would have liked to do, and we hope that in the future this is further tested and tests a lot of the questions that you have. But yeah, I think going through the tips and tools is going to be really good to kind of see how we see all of this translate into actual practical things that you can do. I think that's going to be really valuable and important to complete the answers that we've started giving.
Oh, I wanted to mention too, I see your hand. One of our recommendations to IRCC is to consider having settlement agencies that are more of like a hub. And this has come up a lot. So it could help with referrals for sponsors in a place like Toronto, it's more helpful but challenging, obviously, but having certain agencies that are open to sponsor referrals or the place for sponsor referrals is something that's also come out as one potential option. Barbara, did you want to say anything?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. I just didn't want to leave it without expressing also my gratitude for all the hard work of even the smaller settlement agencies across Toronto, particularly, and across Ontario. It is a reality. We know that many of the settlement agencies have challenges because they don't know themselves what they'll be funded for a few months down the road. So they are often doing the best they can to prepare with information, but themselves then find that the programs they would have wanted to offer are no longer funded for them. So there's an ongoing challenge for them as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead, Michelle. I was just saying we have a few more questions, but we also still have a bit more to go.
I'd say if it's okay, if we could move on, just because we have some guests to speak a little bit, and then maybe Zariah, if we could come back to you. Yeah.
We have a few questions in the chat. Zariah, if you could put your question in the chat as well, and we'll come back to them. We have another block where we can have more questions and discussion. Does that work?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to respond to Barbara's comment. So that was it. But if you don't have time, that's totally okay.
No, that's okay. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that I am a settlement worker, and then we recently became a SAW. We have been working with a lot of sponsors, and they would bring the clients to us, and it worked perfectly. However, the clients, when they came over, then they found out that we exist, and they took it on their own, and they went from agency to agency to agency, and we got calls from different settlement workers that these refugees are going to different settlement organizations for the same thing, because they thought maybe there are more, advantages for them. So it was something that we came up with quite often. And so I just wanted to share with you that, yes, on the settlement side, there are also a lot of problems or a lot of issues that we have to, consider whether or not we can see this or not, or other settlement agencies have taken over, or these were the things that we were also concerned about. So that was what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Zoe. So we're going to move on to the next section. I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Awesome. So sharing experiences. We have one sponsor and one settlement worker who participated in the pilots, and they're here to share with us their experiences of this collaboration on the ground. They're going to be sharing the benefits, the challenges, but also their advice for others on how to work better together. We're going to start with Doris Bean, a private refugee sponsor. And I'm going to stop sharing so we can see her fully. Thanks, Doris.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everyone. I'm Doris Bean, and I've been involved in refugee sponsorship since 2015, at which point in time, the church I attended decided to respond to the Syrian crisis at that time and start a new sponsorship. We originally planned to participate only in the BVOR, or Blended Visa Office Referred Program, and we reached out to MCC. I did see several of the MCC people I've been working with over the last 6 years, so it's nice to see you out there. This led us to sponsor a family of 5 already approved by the government. However, while we were waiting for this family to arrive, or even to be matched with the family, we were approached by several groups asking us to help with relatives or friends. And since we actually had fundraised a fair amount of money, we decided to also help with those private sponsorships. Then, upon arrival of our BVOR family, we quickly found out that they had a minor son in Germany and a daughter-in-law in Turkey, who we ultimately sponsored. So at this point in time, the group that I've been working with, along with MCC, has completed 5 separate refugee applications and have helped bring and settle 10 newcomers to Canada. And the last one will be ending in October 2021. I actually came up with a new group recently, and I'm in the process of probably submitting my application to MCC this week for a new family of 7 people, parents and 5 children, between the ages of 4 to 15. I've become quite enthusiastic about refugee sponsorship following my experiences these last slightly over 5, maybe going on 6 years. When we were approached about the pilot project, we had just been informed that we were going to be expecting Ibrahim. So he was that minor son in Germany of our Bivor family. And after 4 years of much work, he finally arrived on October 5th at age 18. So October 5th during the pandemic last year. Prior to his arrival, we were offered the opportunity to work with a YMCA settlement worker, which we eagerly accepted. After meeting with her and discussing roles and responsibilities, we quickly realized how much she would be helping us. Together, we planned a kickoff meeting with the family, following our agreement. So we did make an agreement, confidentiality, and we really established roles and responsibilities. And then we planned a kickoff meeting with the actual family to introduce her and the various ways she could help. These initial meetings really helped set expectations and ensured everyone understood their role in helping Ibrahim. A plan of action was established. A bonus for us as the sponsoring group and ultimately for the family, because they were still permanent residents and not Canadian citizens, the support was extended to the entire family, kids and parents alike. They directly benefited by getting access to persons in their community that understood their culture, language, and received help with many things that were cropping up even years after our formal sponsorship with them ended. The settlement worker was helpful to us, the sponsors, but she quickly established a relationship directly with the various family members. She met with them all individually to discuss their needs and built a plan to address those needs. We really appreciated her working directly with the family while keeping both them and us updated with progress on the various items. This sponsorship was challenging for many reasons: separation from their son and daughter-in-law, illiteracy, and more, and having the settlement worker step in to help the family, even 4 years after initial arrival in this particular case, was amazing. I'm just going to give some examples of what she helped with even at this later stage. She helped restore child tax benefit because they had missed income tax submissions for mom while she had flown to Germany to be with her minor son. Again, this was not communicated to us. We had no idea as the sponsors. So when the time came, she really helped us navigate that. Ensuring all members had access to school, whether ESL or high school. This had all been established upon arrival, but with a lot of the challenges of COVID and other, she revisited it all and made sure that, and helped us make sure that they were all in the right place. She helped us apply for the hydro subsidy that you can get in our area when they move to a bigger home to accommodate the expanded family. She worked with them to find out where they were on the affordable housing list. This was a challenging task because they are illiterate, as I mentioned earlier, and so many communications were lost along the way. It became a big challenge, and she really helped us navigate that. And of course, she provided access to translators for their daily needs. I could really speak for a long time on this topic, but in the interest of keeping this short, I think the biggest benefit working with our settlement worker was immediate access to more current information. I've seen that theme reoccur several times during the presentation that Michelle and Barbara did. When you sponsor, there is a hurry up and wait happening all the time. By the time you're doing the same thing with a second sponsorship, what happened the first time might not be relevant, not to mention that every single sponsorship is unique and the needs are unique. The settlement worker stays close to this particular community of support and is able to provide very current information. Additionally, I feel that the connections in their community provided by the settlement worker directly to the family are invaluable, and I expect this will continue to be invaluable in the long term, more into the integration part of their life in Canada. I have a few tips for what I think how to work really well with the settlement workers. I think the establishment of the roles and responsibilities upfront go a very long way. Clear expectations ensure everyone understands where and how help is provided. I would also encourage that you always include the family in decision making. And again, I heard that a little while ago. As the key stakeholders in any decision, it is vital you consult and get approval along the way. In our case, our settlement worker was very open to suggestions about our particular family and our 4 years of experience with this family. And she listened to us and adapted plans accordingly. And maybe the best tip, in my opinion, don't have expectations on how it will work. Each family and every sponsorship is unique. I would highly recommend other sponsors work with settlement workers. It greatly reduced the stress on us, the sponsors, and really helped us navigate all the supports that are available for refugee settlement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doris. We also have one of our pilot participants who is a settlement worker at Catholic Cross Cultural Services, Gassia Garabedian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gassia Garabetian. I'm a settlement worker at Catholic Cross Culture Services. So it was a great opportunity for me to directly communicate with co-sponsors and newcomers, refugees prior and post to their arrival. So the relationship between these two groups was totally different. I can pinpoint some of the benefits. Number one, we were able to enhance the support, facilitating and prioritizing their needs by running needs assessment, creating settlement action plan. And the other one was during the ARI pilot, as you may be aware, the settlement worker has more resources and experience in order to help the newcomer refugees. So it was great opportunity and very essential to connect them to the community resources and services. The third thing, speaking the newcomers' language, it was very important to let them feel very comfortable in order to communicate with me, with us, in order to feel free sharing their information. I do speak Armenian, Arabic, and Turkish languages. So there were some challenges in the pilot, some of them connecting with the refugees, newcomers prior to their arrival. There was a time zone difference, but we managed to do that, especially with the newcomers who were not aware using the new communication skills such as Teams, Google, stuff like this. And the last challenge, I can say, gaining the trust of the co-sponsors. It was very important in order to collaborate in refugees' needs and integration in their new home country, Canada. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be to be one of the settlement workers in this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gassia. And thank you again, Doris. Both of you worked really hard with ARI, and we've really, really appreciated your willingness to talk about the project, about your experiences very honestly, and continuing to share how we can make this collaboration better. If you'd like to hear more about from our participants about how they experienced the pilots, we have recorded some videos where you can hear from the refugee participants. You can hear from settlement workers, including Gassia. You can hear from sponsors, including Doris, and you can also hear from participants at the organizational level. The link to those videos was just shared by Michelle in the chat, so please go and have a look. They're not long, they're 4 to 5 minutes each, and give a different aspect to the experience of ARI. Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen again so we can talk about the more practical aspects of ARI. There we go. There we go. Can you see my screen? Yes, awesome. So this second half is the more practical part of the presentation. So what does this all look like in practice? Many of these tools and tips are already happening in the sector, and not all of these are new ideas. These are just some tips based on what we learned and ways you can formalize some of your relationships and work. We'll start by sharing our tips and tools, and then we'll be asking you to share your experiences and ideas in a discussion session at the end. If things come to mind as we're speaking, feel free to share them in the chat, and we'll come back to them as we go. Before we get into the details, we have also made some suggestions on a policy level to IRCC and at an organizational level to SAWS and SPOS. This is a sample of a few actions we're suggesting that could bring the recommendations from ideas to actions. We will be diving more into them next week in our second round table, and you should be getting the link in the chat. For us, for the big picture and small fixes for policy and organizations, we have a few recommendations, including allow information sharing with sponsors to be a fundamental service for SPOS, support for SAWS and SPOS to build more formal partnerships for referral and orientation. So we've touched on those pieces already in our discussion and in our conversations, and we'll be diving more into them next week. So, tips for settlement workers. We want settlement workers to really see sponsors as potential partners and allies in events and local outreach. This can be done by including sponsors and SAWS in outreach strategies to plan ahead and also invite them to co-lead information sharing events. The success of the knowledge exchange pilot really is the subtext of this tip. Also, additionally, attending local SAW events to provide orientation to sponsors and also just taking the time to connect with them can be really beneficial in the long run. We would also encourage taking time to learn about the PSR program and the role of sponsors in the PSR program. You'll see in the chat right now, we're sharing one of our tools, which is a settlement worker training on the PSR program that we delivered in partnership with RSTP. So you can look at those slides that give you kind of the sense of what that training was about. Additionally, the pilots showed us that seeing sponsors early makes a really big difference. So pre-arrival meetings, so meeting with the sponsors pre-arrival either one-on-one or in a group and having some tools to better facilitate role understanding was very important. Post-arrival as well, including the sponsors in the first meeting with the refugees upon their request, of course, was really beneficial. Michelle is going to share a tool now and kind of walk you through one of the tools that we used for our collaborations.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, so this is just an example to show what we mean about using tools to understand roles and responsibilities. Can you see my screen all right, Barbara? Awesome.
Yes.
So this is a tool called the Collaborative Action Plan that was developed by our partners at YMCA and MCCO, Mennonite Central Committee. This is just, we want to share these things with you because we want you to take them, download them, adapt them. If it works for you, if it doesn't, that's fine. We just wanted to give you some starting place that you could maybe consider for these kind of things. So I'm going to walk you through this tool really fast. This might be familiar to Doris. It's the one that was used in her pilot. So the Collaborative Action Plan, it starts talking about roles and responsibilities, and we go a little bit, as we talked about before, how sponsors and settlement agencies, settlement services have different but aligned responsibilities. The biggest part of this tool is really going into the nitty-gritty about settlement responsibilities and dividing up who's responsible for what. You'll see on the screen an example of housing. So it literally goes through every single one of responsibilities and talks about what sponsors usually do, what a settlement worker can offer. And this would have to be changed depending on the agency. Of course, every agency is different. And then what we did is we went with between the settlement worker and sponsor, they would talk about who's going to lead on what, who might provide support in what way. And this was essentially, many of you will know the settlement plan in sponsorship. This is like settlement plan next level and settlement plan more specific for that particular newcomer when they're about to arrive. I'm going to keep going to the end. You can see there's lots of responsibilities, as you all know. But the last bit is around communication. So it was mentioned earlier too. You need to figure out how you'll communicate and when. That's why we recommend having one sponsor who is a representative of the group and can report back. And also, to talk about confidentiality and how it is that that's going to look. I'm going to stop sharing. And if you want to share the slides again, the main thing I wanted to say about this CAP form too is that, if you're going to be using this with sponsors, one thing we learned is that it's maybe not the best tool for later down the road. What it seemed to be most applicable for was planning in advance. Sponsors told us that it really helped them understand right before the newcomer arrived what it would look like. But afterwards, and maybe, 12 months later, things change, and they weren't necessarily going back to this plan, but it was more like a in-depth orientation for them. So that's how we recommend you consider it. And also, if you want to use it with newcomers, you might want to simplify the form quite a lot and the language. It might be better also for new sponsors. So say you're a sponsor who's been around for 30 years, maybe you don't need such an in-depth settlement plan. Could be better for a newer sponsor too. So those are some tips. It's probably in the chat now where you can take a look and adapt how you wish. And yet again, I want to give all credit to the YMCA of Three Rivers and MCCO for that tool. So that brings us to our tips for sponsors. This has actually been covered a bit, so I won't take too much time, but some tips coming out of the pilot agencies or the pilot experience. Of course, we talk about pre-arrival, so maybe reach out to a settlement agency, familiarize yourself in advance. Even if, as Doris said, even if you've been doing this, things change and it's good to get, updated information. In addition, we're suggesting, finding a settlement worker that you can trust and reaching out to them is going to be helpful in the long term. It takes time to develop that trust. And I do want to still add that caveat that not every settlement agency is going to be able to help you and be there for you. Their main client is the newcomer. And so you're going to have to maybe work with your SAW, work with RSTP, work with someone else to find a settlement agency that might be best set up to be able to support the kind of questions you might have. It's important to remember that as you reach out and to set your expectations clearly at that time. The next tips for sponsors, we know that there are lots of sponsor networks that are, developing and are developed that maybe do training. So, we definitely encourage you to invite SPOs to attend your trainings. And, we know this is happening already, but, hopefully over time, you can then develop those more trusting relationships, and it can lead down the road to more formal partnerships that can benefit you. Ensuring the refugee gets a needs assessment upon arrival. So just, remembering that this newcomer, getting them connected as soon as possible is a really best practice. And that includes explaining to the newcomer who their different supports are. We found that, just taking the time to explain that up front really saved a lot of confusion down the road. And I'm going to give you an example again of what that could look like. So one second. We have another tool to share with you called the Guide to Supports for Privately Sponsored Refugees. So you'll see on my screen, it's a very simple document, but really what it's trying to do is explain that you have two main supports when you arrive in Canada. your sponsors, a settlement worker. They're different, but this is what each can offer you. And then we have some tips on, to newcomers to consider what it might look like to access services, some suggestions where to go, or to consider, how do they want their sponsor to be involved or know what's happening, that they're ultimately the ones who are in the driver's seat there and have control and choice. So this is not, a complex tool, but we did develop through the pilots and understanding that some work up front saves a heck of a lot of work down the road, right? And so we encourage you to take this, download this, translate this. We've talked to someone who's offered to translate it into Tigrinya and Arabic. Thank you so much. And share it back with us, if you end up using some of these, because that's our whole goal, is to just make it a little bit easier to work together. So that is the end on the tools. The last thing that I'm going to mention, I'll let Barbara put the slides back up. Our full report is now available. So everything we shared today and everything we'll share next week is in a very readable, I think, 11-page document. If you want to check it out, we're going to put the link in the chat, but we'll also share it afterwards. So don't worry about clicking around. We're going to share that with you if you're interested, and it has more tools. It has the videos and more in-depth information really about what is next in terms of our recommendations and future suggestions. So feel free to check that out. I think we're then now going to pause and go back to questions, and then we will be going into discussion. I'm doing a little time check. It's 2:15-ish. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion.
So like we did previously, we will be doing, I'll stop sharing for now so we can see each other's faces. And we will have the option to submit your question in the chat. I know we had a few from earlier that we haven't been able to answer. And then we are also inviting folks to raise their hand if you have a question. So maybe we can start with the questions we had earlier that we weren't able to get to. I'll start with Maryland. I found this very Ontario-centric, or at least large city-centric. In Nova Scotia, we don't have a choice of SPOs. We work closely together with the Atlantic SAWs. We have a good relationship with our local RSTP trainer, and our CGs do most of the work you are describing the settlement workers doing. We register newcomers with our only SPO as soon as they arrive, so they know what services are there for them. So I think that was more of a comment than a question. And we talked a little bit about the fact that this is it was tested on a small scale, very Ontario-centric, and we would like to see it tested on a larger scale. It'd be interesting to exchange in terms of what happens in Nova Scotia versus what we saw happen in Ontario, and see what similarities, maybe what tools you use, and maybe share on that level would be really neat to see. Next question from Moro is, in your recommendations, you propose to create formal partnerships between SPOs and SAWs. SPOs have a legal contribution agreement with RCC, but SAWs are mostly volunteer-based. How do you propose such a formal partnership might look like?
Thanks for that question, Mauro. I can take a stab at that. So in all of our pilots, we had settlement agencies and SAWs kind of sign MOUs, like memorandums of understanding, to be able to do this work. Actually, we can put a link in the chat. In our report, we give an example of what that could look like as one of the tools. It's really basic though. I mean, yes, settlement agencies have RCC agreements, but they often will have partnerships, with different agencies, outside agencies on collaborating on different things. So we found that it was very successful. It enabled them to have an ongoing relationship. And that's the thing that's going to continue many of the pilots into the future that they report. Yes, a lot of SAWs are volunteer-based though, and we were only able to test this on kind of, I'd say, medium to large SAWs in Ontario. So dealing with capacity issues is something that I think we would really need to address among SAWs. And of course, sponsors who don't have a SAW, it would again look different. And that's, I'll just make a quick plug there that May had put her information, I think, in the chat. Do you want to say something about getting connected to a settlement agency?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Just quickly, this is a new project in regards to making the connection between sponsored refugees who had been sponsored through groups of 5 and community sponsors, connecting them with settlement organizations in the community of settlement. So I'll be managing this project. So you're welcome if you're a group of 5 or if you know of any groups of 5 or community sponsors expecting arrivals and they wish to establish a relationship with a SPO, with a settlement organization, you're welcome to contact me. I dropped my email in the chat. I can add my phone number as well, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, May. I hope we answered your question, Mauro. If not, happy to have a follow-up question. Just share it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. The next question is from Barbara. The Private Refugee Sponsor Network has created a model to connect, learn, and share. It is working on building relationship with settlement agencies from a different perspective. How do you see what you propose involving the network?
I could take a start at this. I think it's great that there are networks of sponsors in Ontario and across Canada who've been doing this work. I have to say, for a long time and newly, I think all collaboration is beneficial. So we're encouraging that in any way that makes sense for you to continue to build those relationships. So I think it's great. I don't know what else to say, but I think it's very beneficial. Whether it's a network, a SAW, a SPO that starts that, those connections are great.
Wonderful. I'm trying to keep up with the chat. I don't know if anyone had a question they wanted to ask out loud about whether it's about our recommendations or about the tools and practical aspects. Louisa, go ahead.
Hi, it's Louisa Taylor from Refugee 613. I just saw a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you've got to it yet, or a comment from Barbara Sheffield. Is that the one you were just referring to? Mm-hmm. So I think that it's a really good comment because it gets to confusion in the sector, and confusion that I think really begins with the messaging that our IRCC gives literally in its forms, and that SAWs have been given, were given in the early days of sponsorship, which is that private sponsors are responsible for settlement. The current interpretation of that, and IRCC's intentions of that, as they've expressed it to us several times, is they don't want that private sponsors to mean they have to do it all, and that they have to know it all, and that they have to go out and recreate settlement services. In fact, they encourage sponsors to connect with settlement and together figure out who can do what, and really make use of the expertise that settlement agencies have. So rather than have a mindset that you only go to settlement when there's a problem, it should be that you connect with settlement and you can express what a sponsorship group is able to take on, and the settlement professional can help you with that and tell you what their services offer, and it's going to be different in different communities for different agencies, but very much that it should be an intentional and early relationship. And so in the research, in the early phases of the research, we did hear from sponsors who've been doing this for decades who said, I only go to settlement when I have a problem or when something won't really work out. And that's actually not the intention of the program as it's currently constituted.
Thank you, Louisa. We only have 5 minutes left, so we know there are a few questions in the chat and we will make sure to circle back to everyone. But we wanted to move on to our discussion questions, and I'm going to share them in the chat and read them out loud as well. So we wanted to hear from you. What are your tips and tools for working better with settlement or sponsors, depending on which one you are? If you have tips and tools that we really didn't cover in our conversation, we'd be really excited to hear from your perspective and your experiences. And then a second question, you can take one or the other. What would you like to see moving forward to continue to build understanding between settlement workers and sponsors?
Maybe for time's sake too, feel free to just put a thought in the chat and we can just like see them all since we just have a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for joining us. Good luck. Sarah, any ideas, any tips and tools? Because we know this work is already happening, whether it's formally or differently from what we've talked about, and also just what you would like to see more of in terms of collaboration in the sector. Go ahead, Doris.
This is very practical and not necessarily, but it's something that I found, kind of bit me as I was working through these various sponsorships. And that's just to be very clearly documenting what you're doing as you go so you can refer back. I often find myself trying to search through email to find that little tidbit of information that somebody provided to me, whether it's a settlement worker or whoever, it doesn't matter. And I'm starting a brand new sponsorship right now, and my plan is I'm writing everything down in one place, and it really does help because there's so many little things that happen throughout the life of a sponsorship, and it's very practical. It doesn't speak to what we're talking about here necessarily, but it does help from a sponsor perspective. All the contact information, who you use for whatever, it does change, but it's really, really helpful to have that in one place.
No, I think it's a very valuable thing to add. I remember information, then remember where it's coming from. It's a good way to keep track of all those things and double check and go back to people.
Problem is I get emails from various people and I might have hundreds of emails from, and to find that one email can be, even with search tools, but nonetheless.
Thank you, Doris. Did anyone else have a practical tool or tip or have anything?
There's a chat, Barbara. I don't know if you want me to share it. Andrea says, we began a pre-arrival intake process between our SAW and SPO. This has helped a bit, but with these tools, it will help even more. That's great. Yeah, there's a lot of different processes I know folks are putting in place.
Awesome. We hope it's helpful, Andrea. And once you do have some of those things set up, it'd be great to hear back. And if you could share back with us how some of these have been adapted, that'd be wonderful.
Great. I'm sorry, I think we'll probably wrap up. So if you could put the last slide up, Barbara, that'd be great. And there's a few more chats, so please take a look at that. But I want to let you all off on time. So yes, we'd like to thank you for being here. This is how you can reach us. So we'll share this in the chat as well. We have a newsletter if you want to know about upcoming things, and our emails are there. Of course, we want to say a thank you to our funder, IRCC, and also a thank you again to our pilot partners, to our advisory group members, and to everyone who participated in ARI from the very beginning. This has been, 3 years worth of work, and it took many people to get us to this place. We will share this slides and the report afterwards, and want to thank you all for coming here today. Yeah, any last comments, Barbara?
No, I think we've covered a lot today. We're really grateful for all of you. And remember that we have our second roundtable next week, where we'll be going more into the recommendations that we've made at a policy level and giving a bird's eye view of what we think the way forward should be. Hopefully we'll see most of you there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, May. Thank you, Doris.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gassia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thanks
much
being
for
here.
your
Yeah, stay safe.
participation. You too.
Bye-bye.